Canada should be our 51st state.
This decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship with the United States is now over.
Here is a fact that will not make many American headlines. 91% of Canadians, 9 in 10, now say they want their country to rely less on the United States. Not repair the relationship, less reliance. That figure comes from the Angus Reid Institute, one of Canada's most respected polling organizations. It is the highest anti-American sentiment recorded in Canada since modern polling began. This is the most economically integrated border on the planet. Two countries that have been each other's largest trading partners, closest military allies, and most open neighbors for over a century. And something broke. This video is going to show you exactly what broke, exactly who it's costing, and, whether you're watching from Canada or the United States, exactly why it matters to you. To understand how significant this rupture is, you have to understand what the relationship actually looked like before 2025. Canada and the United States trade approximately $700 billion in goods and services every year. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. Not a majority, 36. That means for most of the continental United States, the most important foreign customer for their goods is not China, not Germany, not the European Union. It is Canada. On the Canadian side, the dependence runs even deeper. Trade represents 67% of Canada's GDP, compared to only 24% of US GDP. That asymmetry is the single most important number for understanding everything that follows. The United States can absorb pain from this relationship souring. Canada structurally cannot, at least not without dramatic, costly adjustment. The two countries share the longest undefended border in the world. Their military forces train together, share intelligence under the NORAD agreement, and have stood side by side in every major Western alliance since the Second World War. Their supply chains are not just integrated. In the automotive sector, a single car part can cross the border 8 times before the finished vehicle is complete. This is the context in which Donald Trump, in January 2025, began calling Canada the 51st state.
I'd like to see Canada become our 51st state.
When asked directly whether he was serious, Trump confirmed he was not joking. And then Canada answered,
This will never ever happen.
And then, more powerfully, Canada answered at the ballot box. On April 28, 2025, Canada held a federal election. For the first time in modern Canadian history, a federal campaign was fought almost entirely on the question of what to do about the United States. The Liberal Party, which had been trailing badly in the polls, won. And historians note directly that Trump's rhetoric and tariffs were so galvanizing that they single-handedly helped the Liberals recover, turning a party that was losing badly into a majority government. The 51st state gambit didn't bring Canada closer. It produced the most defiant Canadian government in a generation. On March 4th, 2025, the United States government imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports and 10% on Canadian energy, invoking emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The stated justification was border security and drug trafficking. Canada's response was immediate. Canada retaliated with 25% tariffs on approximately 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of US imports, with provinces adding their own measures, including restrictions on U.S. alcohol sales in government-run liquor stores. Now, here is the critical thing to understand about who this hurts more. When you impose a tariff shock on a country where trade is 2/3 of the entire economy, the damage is structural, not peripheral. Economists estimate the 2025-26 tariff cycle has already reduced Canadian GDP by 1.5% to 2%, with Canadian households absorbing an estimated $1,700 to $2,000 in higher annual costs. But the United States is not immune. American families could lose an estimated $1,300 per year. U.S. gasoline prices could rise 30 to 70 cents per gallon due to the energy tariff. And Ontario alone, which supports 675,000 direct export-related jobs, faces severe exposure that flows directly back into American supply chains. In the automotive sector, the pain is acute. Ontario's motor vehicle parts industry faces a potential GDP reduction of more than 20% in 2026 compared to a no-tariff scenario. And because U.S. and Canadian auto manufacturing are so deeply intertwined, that hits American plants too. General Motors presented its 2026 outlook to investors with $3 to $4 billion in expected tariff costs listed as a key financial risk. And Canada has been responding beyond just tariffs. Prime Minister Carney has set a goal for Canada to double its non-U.S. exports in the next decade, traveling to India, Australia, and Europe to diversify trade away from dependence on the U.S., which currently takes more than 75% of Canada's exports. European exports from Canada are already up 22% in 2025 compared to 2024. The trade war was supposed to leverage Canada into compliance. Instead, it appears to be accelerating Canada's strategic decoupling from the U.S. economy. Now here is the part of this story that gets almost no coverage in American media, and yet it may be the most strategically significant piece of all. According to the Canadian Energy Regulator, 93% of Canada's total oil exports went to the United States in 2024, and U.S. crude oil imports from Canada averaged 4.1 million barrels per day, making Canada the single largest source of American crude oil imports. Read that again. The United States imports more oil from Canada than from any other country on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than any OPEC member. And yet, Trump's argument is that the U.S. doesn't need Canada. Here is the complexity that rarely gets explained. While Canada could theoretically restrict oil exports to the U.S., doing so would create a domestic constitutional crisis. Canada's pipeline infrastructure begins in Western Canada, but passes through U.S. territory to reach Eastern Canada. Cutting off oil to the U.S. would also cut off oil to Ontario and Quebec. That is the paradox of decades of continental integration. The infrastructure was built to serve the relationship, and now the relationship is the infrastructure. But Canada is moving to change that. In November 2025, Prime Minister Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith agreed to work toward a new pipeline to the Pacific Coast, aiming to ship 1 million barrels per day to Asia and reduce Canada's energy dependence on the U.S. Carney's words were direct. He called the federal government's energy dependence on the United States a weakness that must be addressed. He said, "Nostalgia is not a strategy. The U.S. has changed. That's their right. We must respond. That's our imperative." This is what strategic energy independence looks like in practice. It takes years to build, but once the infrastructure exists, the leverage disappears. From both sides, the U.S. can no longer use market access as pressure, and Canada can no longer be held hostage to a single customer. The irony is that the tariff war may have done more to motivate Canadian energy independence than any domestic Canadian political debate ever did. Now, let's talk about defense, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and where the evidence does not support a simple narrative of American aggression and Canadian victimhood. Canada has been below the NATO defense spending target of 2% of GDP for over 3 decades. In 2024, Canada spent roughly 1.37% of GDP on defense, among the lowest in the alliance. The official plan, under former Prime Minister Trudeau, was to reach 2% by 2032. Trump's pressure, aggressive, public, and unrelenting, changed the timeline dramatically. In June 2025, Prime Minister Carney announced that Canada would reach the 2% NATO target for the current fiscal year, a benchmark not hit since 1990, injecting an additional $9.3 billion into the defense budget. But then the target moved. At the NATO summit in The Hague in June 2025, member nations agreed to a new target, 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. That is more than double the 2% target Canada had only just reached. And it gives Trump a significant policy victory, one that will cost every NATO member enormously. And perhaps most tellingly, Carney said during the NATO summit that he had been speaking with European allies about the possibility of buying European fighter jets and submarines, rather than the American-made F-35s and U.S. defense equipment Canada had long been committed to purchasing. The country that has been a loyal buyer of American military equipment for generations is now actively exploring European alternatives. Not because of ideology, because of uncertainty about whether its most important ally is actually reliable. That is the structural shift that defense analysts are watching most carefully. It is not the spending number, it is where the spending goes. The last impact area is the hardest to quantify, but the data makes it undeniable. Something happened to Canadian national identity in 2025, and it happened fast. The percentage of Canadians with an unfavorable view of the United States in 2025 hit its highest level since the Pew Research Center began asking the question in 2002. That's over 2 decades of polling. The previous peak was at the end of Trump's first term. This time, it happened faster, and it went further. 9 in 10 Canadians disagree with the idea that the two countries should ever unite, with 8 in 10 in strong disagreement. And 1 in 4 Canadians now says they never even considered plans to visit the United States in 2025. The travel numbers are extraordinary. Canadian residents returning from the United States by car in August 2025 dropped 34% compared to the same month in the prior year, the 8th consecutive month of year-over-year declines. The number returning by air fell 25% in the same month. The U.S. tourism industry is projecting a $5.7 billion loss in 2025-2026, driven by what analysts are calling a sustained, politically motivated boycott. 6 in 10 Canadians say U.S. government policies have made them less likely to travel to the U.S. in the next 12 months. And in the grocery store, which is where economic policy becomes personal, the Buy Canadian movement has fundamentally reshaped retail. In February 2025, 98% of Canadians surveyed said they were looking for Made in Canada labels when shopping. Half said they were replacing as many American products as they could find substitutes for. The Wilson Center, one of Washington's most respected nonpartisan think tanks, described this moment with striking precision. Between 1984 and 2024, there were no anti-American political parties or major political figures in Canadian national politics. In 2025, none of the parties or their leaders can be unreservedly pro-American and hope to win. That is not a polling blip. That is a structural change in the political landscape of a G7 democracy that has been America's closest partner for 80 years. So, 3 things to leave with. 1. The economic costs of this rupture are real, documented, and flowing in both directions. Canada absorbs more proportionally because trade is 67% of its GDP, but the United States is not insulated. American manufacturers, farmers, gas consumers, and the tourism industry are all paying a measurable price. 2. Canada's strategic response is structural, not symbolic. A Pacific pipeline changes the energy leverage equation permanently. European military procurement changes the defense relationship permanently. And a generation of Canadian consumers learning to read country of origin labels changes brand loyalty in ways that take decades to rebuild. 3. The sovereignty shift in Canadian public opinion is the least reported but potentially most consequential development of all. The Pew Research Center data shows Canadian unfavorability toward the U.S. at the highest level ever recorded. That does not recover quickly. The USMCA, the trade agreement that governs this relationship, is scheduled for a joint review in July 2026. Whatever happens in that review will shape the North American economic order for the decade that follows. That is the moment both sides of this border should be watching. Here is the one thing you can do today that costs you nothing. Go to opensecrets.org, search your representative's name, and look at who funds them and what their position has been on trade policy. That knowledge is available to every American. And for Canadian viewers, Statistics Canada's trade data portal gives you real-time numbers on how your economy is shifting. Both links are in the description. If this video gave you a clearer picture of something that was hard to see from either side of the border, share it with someone on the other side.